Hello everyone, welcome to the second installment of this limited edition web series, Why Sound Poetry, in which I gather resources that will hopefully convince a person or two that sound poetry is and can be a seriously respected form of art. In this second installment, in which I narrate an article written by the legendary Australian sound poetry practitioner Jas H. So Jas H. I actually made a video essay about his life on my YouTube channel, which you can check out. It's meant to be the definitive video biography of Jas H. because I feel he is an extremely underrated presence in the history of poetry, which is, something I'm trying to lift off the ground as well. And the name of this article is Sounds, Sound Poetry, and Sound Text Compositions. This article first appeared in NMA 10 magazine. In it, the author takes a fresh look at sound poetry in the 20th century and offers some practical advice to the sound poet, sound text compositionists of today. Included is a previously unpublished performance poem. And that's also part of the webpage that I'm on to recite this. So I hope you all find great joy in this. Sounds. There exists an art form that, like an elephant, is instantly recognizable, but, again like an elephant, is difficult to define. This is where a human voice, a remarkably versatile device, is modulated to produce loud sounds, soft sounds, high sounds, low sounds, fast sounds, slow sounds, and all sorts of sounds in between. Ever since the dawn of time, people have made sounds come out of their mouth and nose. Some of these sounds get put in the box marked speech, while others get put in the box marked music. Some don't seem to be either and can't find an appropriately labeled box, but when looked at closely, our speech and music boxes can be seen to have elastic sides and to have a lust to couple with each other. Sound poetry in the Church's era. Sound poetry, as normally defined, makes a first appearance in the early 20th century as an outrider of the great army of modernism. Of course, there were sounds long before that, but they needed clothes that convinced listeners that they were really something else. The pernicious nature of the times meant that the modernists organized themselves rather like secret societies or political parties or schismatic Christian churches. That is, they were small groups of true believers, generally led by some sort of messiah figure, example being Marinetti, Gumilev, Andor, Breton, Herawath Walden, who constructed a canon of acceptable works, welcomed in right-minded colleagues and collaborators, produced Bibles and prayer books for new recruits, denounced false prophets, and excommunicated spies and traitors. In this way, futurists, both Italian and Russian brands, expressionists, Germans, and others, Dadaists, Surrealists, and their innumerable splinter groups rampaged across culture, throwing up a few sounds of interest in amongst their denunciations of the bourgeois and each other. The spirit of the times ensured no cooperation between the various churches. The various messiahs spent as much time claiming that they were the first and denouncing the false messiahs of the church next door as actually producing sounds. For instance, the Dadaist movement had a very short life as a movement, but then Dadaists found a much more satisfying occupation, lasting 40 years or more, arguing with each other about who had thought up the name Dada. This religious dissension means that futurists ignore surrealists, expressionists ignore Dadaists, and so on through all the possible permutations and combinations. Historians of modernism generally have trouble with anything outside narrow fields of reference. and find no difficulty in discussing Schwitters while ignoring Strom, analyzing ARP while ignoring Marinetti, and mentoring Heinecke while ignoring Hausmann. Although sound poetry should be able to leap the boundaries of national languages, anthologists insist on inserting French sound poets into French language anthologies, Germans into German books, and Americans into books dealing with America. Sounds and obsessions. Various obsessions governed the work of leading sound poets of the Church's era. Marinetti, futurist of Italy, and Heinecke, expressionist of Germany, became obsessed with war and strove to write works which would reproduce the sounds and emotions of battles. With Marinetti, this took the form of sheets of sound intended to represent artillery shells bursting, machine guns and rifles firing, landmines exploding, cries of the wounded and dying, and the triumphant shouts of the victors. And various sound poems resulted. Heinecke, although equally a war lover, in contrast went for a single note system and produced works like Blood, Mud, Death, Brown Flood Again, Back, Past, etc., or Attack. Expressionist sound poetry is characterized by this telegraph style, first used by Strom and refined by Heinecke. Dadaists liked to think of themselves as wild men who had broken all forms of restraint and whose work required a certain amount of randomness, unexpectedness, and chance decisions. However, they mostly lacked any real talent for improvisation and fell back on memorized scripts. For example, Hugo Ball's Caravane, which you can look up online. It's very accessible. Hausmann, a little later in time, made a virtue of this and claimed that the typographic style of this, that he coined phonemes, allowed the reader to instantly recognize what sound was intended. Mayakovsky, the futurist of Russia, wrote conventional rhyming poetry, but he was a much more practiced, competent, and able reader of his work in public than small-scale people like the Dadaists for all their technical innovations. Mayakovsky was called on to perform to much larger audiences, often indifferent to art and potentially hostile. And to perform more often, he developed a method of laying out his work on the page to assist the performer, which looked something like what is presented on the webpage. In which they're more the poster poems presented by Hausmann. The German Kurt Schwitters, who existed on the Dadaist fringes, the Dadaist Synod denounced him as bourgeois, even though he developed a similar method. He was also a practiced and confident performer, much more interested in performance than in the theory of performance. He was also a painter, a collagist, a constructor of mysterious towers made of everyday objects, an advertising artist, a writer of cryptic little playlets, a lover of puns, and a wearer of double-breasted, chalk-stripped suits. Chalk-striped suits. Critics on the whole dislike all-rounders and prefer Johnny One notes of taste and refinement. Others. Of course, there were other sound poets of ability around during these times, and some of them managed to appeal to wide audiences by the trick of not labeling their sound poetry as art. For instance, Rudyard Kipling managed to write a sound poem, Boots, 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 moving over Africa, boots, 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 moving up and down again, which millions of people who regarded modern artists rather like a dangerous species of rattlesnake managed to bellow out with love and devotion, while intellectuals cowered back in horror at the vulgarity of it all. The churches in ruins. The period of the modernist churches died away, and although some of the sound exponents lived for many years afterwards, the decision-makers of art were soon able to brand their work as old hat, passé, etc., and completely ignore it. This strand of sound poetry soon became only of interest to fussy antiquarians obsessed with splitting ancient hairs. Mayakovsky shot himself dead, and his ghost was embraced by Stalin. He was and is the greatest poet of our socialist epoch, and indifference to his memory is a crime, which has ensured that his work counts for zilch. Hitler, the people, and the Tom A. Edison grab bag of delights. Meanwhile, back in the real world, non-artists and non-modernists were also producing sounds. Microphones, phonographs, radios, amplified public address systems, motion pictures, advertising jingles, and the whole Tom A. Edison grab bag of delights enabled singers and songwriters to forget about Beautiful Dreamer, My Grandfather's Clock, the harp that once in terrace halls, and similar horrors of the previous generations, and write things like Maisie Dotes and Dozy Dotes and Little Lambs Eat Ivy. I taught a pooty hat tat, and he thwam all over the dom, which exposed the people to something other than rigid forms of convention. Jazzmen, used to blowing down trumpets and saxophones, discovered that they could make interesting sounds without the trumpet or the saxophone. Listen to Clark Terry's Mumbles or Dizzy Gillespie's Salt Peanuts. Demagogic politicians like Hitler found suitably amplified sound poetry highly necessary. Demagogic politicians like Hitler found suitably amplified sound poetry highly necessary. Examination of Hitler's speeches will show that many of them consist almost entirely of loaded and coded phrases like Das ganze Volk, Deutschland, and Juden raus, endlessly repeated in the Schwitter's manner. After these performances, nobody should doubt the ability of sound poetry to inspire millions of listeners. In addition, Hitler had powers denied to the various messiahs of modernism, as he could imprison, torture, and kill rival artists with impunity and without reprisals. Hitler could also involve the whole German people in his sound poetry by eschewing the passive acquiescence required by previous and subsequent dictators and have his subjects shout "Hail Hitler" every time they open their mouths. A new breed makes its presence felt. After this convulsion had resolved itself, little was left of sound poetry or sound poets. In its place rose another breed of human voice sound, this one deriving from new music, of the North American brand rather than the European. Instead of from modernist language, its exponents were usually American, had attended some cultural educational establishment, were usually quiet and well-behaved, no wild men this time, were quite well informed about culture and its place in society, and had a proper respect for good design, Wall Street, Coca-Cola, the civilizing mission of the USA. The hopelessness of socialism, the benefits of business-driven technology, and the burning question, what happened to our simple country virtues? The USA and a paradigm shift. The USA, being a society of traditions and backward glances over traveled roads, is currently hurtling back into a high-tech version of the 13th century. The nobility of gentry are fortifying themselves in castles guarded by paid bodyguards. The universities are in a similar role to that played by medieval monasteries. Sports and television, now closely linked, have taken over from religious festivals. Every now and then, crusaders are sent to foreign parts to smite infidels. The phrase "only in America" is often invoked. Art must conform to this paradigm shift. It must either make itself indispensable to the nobility and gentry, or get involved in the religious festival business. There thus has to be a certain amount of giving the customer what the customer thinks the customer wants. This differs from the church's era, where the various messiahs decided that what the customer thought the customer wanted was totally unimportant. What mattered was what the Messiah wanted. Johnny One notes of taste and refinement. Instead of their speech being the denunciation of the bourgeois and rival artists, this new breed instead spoke a language of technological fashion, vaguely reminiscent of the fashion pages of Vogue, where the slightest misphrasing inexorably identified the washed-up past has been true citizens of a land where the poor won't work because they're paid too much, while the rich won't work because they're not paid enough. This new breed where no poets, so their work was not sound poetry. Instead, they produced sound text compositions. They did not read in the strident, vehement manner associated with Marinetti or Hitler, but in a low-key, buttoned-down sort of voice, suitable for the titillation of cultured moneybags in search of something new. The age of Cold Wars and thermonuclear devices cultivated restrained works like Charles Amerconian's The Drano Ducks Collide. A certain gentle satire, often at the expense of the cultured moneybags, is present. To tell the truth, denunciations of the bourgeois could have remained in fashion. No cultured moneybags wants to be mistaken for a bourgeois. Presentation, a minor concern in the age of churches, became important. Critics still preferred Johnny One notes of taste and refinement. In a way, this fawning and trucking to cultured moneybags is a throwback to the days of W.A. Mozart, when musicians occupied a similar position to grooms, valets, and chambermaids. Real-world developments. Real-world sounds still continued to appear, although trumpets and saxophones ceased to be people's weapons. They became art. They were replaced by electric guitars, disembodied keyboards, and samplers as the people's sound devices. This enabled people's musicians to warble lugubrious and lachrymose songs of love, along with amplified chords stolen from ancient bluesmen and gospel singers from long-lost cotton plantations. Advertising, or giving the customer what they really want, continued to be a major artistic influence. It was also the age of hi-fi and stereo, of wide screens in theaters and small screens in living rooms, t-shirts, hair, recreational drugs, and a certain amount of aggressive and fumbling sex. Morality was determined by accountants and taxpayers. Image often overpowers sound in people's culture. Tailoring triumphs and costume aptness is equated with moral worth. But there was still room for bebop, aluba, bip, bum, bop, spark-a-lark, a larkaling, safe as milk. Drove my Chevy to the levee, but the levee was dry. And 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? The spirit of nostalgia and revivalism. Revivalism and the spirit of nostalgia also revived some interesting work in the style of the Church's era, such as the Four Horsemen from Canada. Listen to their Assassin or Mayakovsky. Like most revivalists, they are better than the original. Unlike the Church's era, there is more work for women, example Meredith Monk. Women of the Church's era were to be seen and not heard. A modern virtuoso. The 1980s did produce a genuine virtuoso, Paganini of the voice, a performer with more talent than Schwitters or Marinetti or Mayakovsky. This is Bobby McFerrin. Like most virtuosi, he is as capable of embarrassing and infuriating admirers and potential admirers in that his taste and his abilities often seem on a collision course. He is always liable to halt and give all the credit to Jesus, or break into Don't Worry, Be Happy. But he has really got it with the capital I, and his record, The Voice, is sound poetry as it should be sounded. Listen particularly to I'm My Own Walkman. Let's hope that his hit records give him a good living, without the fawning and truckling to cultured moneybags that artists have to go through in order to survive. What is to be done? Sound poetry and sound text compositions have never occupied center stage, while they have remained under those labels. Sound poets, or ST compositionists, who got into the spotlight, like Kipling and Hitler, acquired millions of admirers while dressing up sound poetry as the essential rightness of British imperialism, or the historic mission of the German people to bash the Jews. Let there be no mistake over the popularity. At one time, Boots was being declaimed on every music hall stage in the British Empire, while at another time, the raucous but powerful sounds of Hitler shrieked from every German radio set. The sound poetry was noisy and flashy, like the organized violence that these authors saw as the answer to all problems. Audiences stood ready to cheer every statement, no matter what it was. To them, imperialism was good in all its forms. Jew bashing was good in all its forms. When Hitler was regarded as a mighty elemental force, mad genius, or vulgar little man, are as far as critics want to go in criticism then and now. His gentle contemporary Schwitters was, and is, universally regarded as a weirdo. So, the sound poet, or sound text compositionist of today who seeks fame, recognition, and non-wimpishness needs to tap into some currently popular cause. And what is popular today with decision-making important people? Obviously, economics of the modifying Adam Smith brand, with AS's enlightened self-interest being replaced with just plain self-interest. The sound text composition, The Economist's song, is suggested as a surefire winner of popularity. This was written by Bobby McFerrin. Oh, sorry. This article was written by Jas H. Duke. I really hope you learned something or found this at very least entertaining or inspiring. And again, I hope you can find the time to check out my video essay on Jas H. Duke's life. And this has been John Burness, hosting the limited web series Why Sound Poetry. And thank you very much for tuning in.